going to jump into the story. It's not very, well, once you go into it, it's quite simple. As you can see, it's not very long. It's kind of quite a sort of extended conceit, we would say. So it's just one idea. London is supposedly civilized, but actually it's full of people who are suffering. That is the central idea. So every new stanza is a bit of a progression or a development of that idea. It's a different kind of detail that reinforces that opinion that's at the center of the poem. So he says, I wander through each mapped street, near where the mapped river Thames flows. I notice that every face I meet has signs of weakness and expressions of sadness. In every shout of every man, in every child's cry of fear, in every voice, in every curse, I hear the oppression of these people's own minds. How the blackening church is horrified by the cries of the chimney sweeper, and the sigh of the unfortunate soldier runs in blood down palace walls. But most of all, through the streets at midnight, I hear how the curse of the young prostitute blasts the newborn child's ears and ruins the marriage hearse with disease. So the idea really is that all of the good things, the great things about London and the great things about British culture and civilization at this point when he's writing, he's saying all this is totally undermined because in our own cities we have so much suffering and poverty. There's children who are afraid. There's oppression everywhere. It's about poverty, a lot of it. So the state of the poor and how they're suffering, and they're just kind of living in this supposedly very advanced culture that can't even take care of its own people. He's very anti-church, Blake. So he's not anti-religious. He's a hyper-religious person. He very much believed in his God, but he had a personal relationship with his God that was not to do with the church. So he's anti-institutional. He doesn't like churches or organized religion, but he is very, very spiritual, and he has his own very strong religious beliefs. He actually had visions of angels and all sorts of things that form part of his poetry. So even though he's against the church, you don't want to say he's an anti-religious poet, because that would be wrong. But he doesn't like the way that the church in this time, he feels, has become really controlling and oppressive in a lot of ways, and also not really effective in targeting the things that it should be doing. So talking about the church being blackened is a bit of a symbol there. It's like, yeah, the church is getting corrupted, it's getting kind of dark, and it's not really functioning how it should as a religious entity. There's this idea that, newborn children can hear prostitutes outside their window. It's a very shocking image. It's deliberately shocking, especially for this time. It's quite an offensive kind of thing to say. As soon as a child's born into this world, they're surrounded by prostitutes. But it's a sort of reminder of the sort of corruption at the heart of the city. And again, this idea that everything that should be pure and innocent and good is being undermined by all this corruption that he sees around him. So I'm going to actually skip to context first, and just before I go through the language structure and form, just go a bit into that, because I think it's really important in this poem. It's the more that you understand the context behind a poem, the more it will kind of click into place. So this is published as part of a collection titled Songs of Experience. I recommend you read the whole collection. It's really brilliant. 1794, so the turn of the century, from the 1700s to the 1800s. Songs of Experience, all of the poems in there are about the loss of innocence. They're all pessimistic, and they're all about the modern human condition. So the idea is he published these two collections, Songs of Innocence and then Songs of Experience. Songs of Innocence is really, celebration of life, and it's really joyful. It's quite pastoral, so you have a lot of natural imagery, countryside imagery. Songs of Experience is a lot more industrial at times, and it's tragic, and most of the poems in Songs of Experience are quite critical in some way or another. So even though this poem itself is highly critical, it also comes from this entire collection whose purpose is to critique the modern human condition and look at the problems with modern humans and how we live. He's a romantic poet as well. I don't know if I've even wrote that here. Let me have a look. Did I write that? No. Yeah, Blake is a romantic poet, capital R. So have a quick search of romanticism and what romantic poets are if you want to understand him in more depth. I do go into that in some of the other poems in the Power and Conflict collection. So if you're watching this video as part of that whole series, you probably get a sense of what romanticism is from some of the other lessons there. Good. So yeah, chartered. I know I keep banging on about this word. It feels important. It starts off with this word chartered and then it repeats it. Chartered street, chartered Thames. It seems significant, so I've kind of gone into it in the context as well here. I think it's the antithesis between the idea of civilization, the mapping out and controlling of the landscape that we have when we build a city from, nature, from a natural starting point. It's the idea of a charter, which is the official founding of a city by king or queen. Charters map out cities, but also they relate to legal things, so they're to do with the law of the city and the citizens, what people are able to do or not do within that city that's been chartered or established. So he's criticizing the government, he's criticizing possibly even the monarch, the way in which London has been constructed as a city and the way in which the laws of London are set at this time. So Thomas Paine, a friend of Blake's, who is also a political activist, you can put this in your essays, you don't have to. I think if you're going to do really deep analysis, it's maybe a good thing to pick up on, because especially if you're doing that power and conflict, it's kind of about conflict of the individual versus the government, or maybe the power of institutions versus the power of the individual. There's a lot of ways you can bring the theme of power or the theme of conflict into this context point. So Thomas Paine, this guy who's a political activist, someone who's actively involved in changing politics for the better as they see it, he criticized royal charters as a form of oppression because these royal charters are written by upper classes and they have imposition on freedom for the lower working classes. Charters create corporations, and so Blake is criticizing probably capitalistic big business at the same time, the way in which large and powerful institutions control the masses. So basically what he's saying is all of these laws that we've so supposedly made are made with rich people in mind, and they're created by rich people for rich people, and they don't really support the poor. So if you look at them on paper, they sound great, but if you wander through London, you can see the damage that these types of laws that have been put in place are doing. So you want to just remember that phrase, royal charters, and you could say that it's, if you're writing an essay, this poem is perhaps a criticism of the way in which royal charters oppress the lower working classes, and Blake can see physical evidence of that in his city when he walks around London. Good. Yeah, so I'll stop with the chartered now, but it is important. The River Thames as well is interesting. You might have been to London and seen the river. Pretty much anyone who's been to London has seen the river. It's huge. It goes right through the middle of London. And it's reasonably nice now. It's probably still quite polluted, in my opinion, but nothing like it was in the 1700s. So when Blake is writing, this is a very polluted river, one of the most polluted in the world. They just dump things in there, like bodies get thrown in there and they drown. There's rats, there's factories dumping pollutants, there's sewage from the fact that there's overcrowded cities with no real drainage. Like we have, if you go to London now, thankfully there's proper drainage, but that was put in the 1860s. So that's like 60 years after he writes this poem, there's finally drainage in the London rivers. So he's slightly kind of playing around with the idea of the Thames, because a lot of English poets, even nowadays, they have this sort of love relationship with the Thames, and the Thames represents London, and they sort of write about it in this glorified way. And here Blake is being really honest. He's honest about what he sees in real life if he goes to that place. He goes to that river and he walks around. This is what he sees, and it's not anything to glorify. It's actually something to be a bit ashamed of if you're a supposedly advanced city, as London claims to be. So in some ways, he's kind of having a go at, or kind of sort of denouncing, we might say, if you want to put it in essay words, poets before him who always talk about how amazing the Thames is, because he's like, no, it's polluted and it's horrible, and if you walk around there, it's not a pleasant experience. So yeah, there's a sense of him being quite real and quite honest about what he feels is going on in the city. This is quite important as well as a final point. So in the 1700s, and a lot of Romantic poets are obsessed with this idea of the French Revolution. There's a lot of revolutions in Europe in the 1700s. So a lot of different countries are undergoing like a new system of government, or a change in government, or their entire structures are getting broken down and reorganized. So the French Revolution is particularly important, but there are several other revolutions in Europe as well at the time. In 1789, the French monarchy is overthrown. They get rid of the king and they replace the king with a government. And so they have this sense that, it's a new start and you can rebuild your society for the better. And it's not just the king that's in power who gets to say how, the government works. So we didn't actually end up having a revolution in England or Britain. We still have a queen now, which I actually quite like. I really love the queen. She's lovely. So yeah, we didn't actually revolt. We didn't have this kind of revolt. But at the time, people don't know that. They think the French have a new government. Other countries in Europe have a new government. Why can't Britain? So a lot of intellectuals actually were inspired by this, and they were quite politically active and radical. And they thought perhaps that we should also have a revolution, get rid of our monarchy, and just have a government the same as the French had done. So I feel like Blake's criticism is so big. Like, he thinks that the entire structure of London is wrong. It's not just one person to blame or one thing that's wrong. It's like the entire system needs a reform. So it's quite radical politically, and he feels that the whole structure is in serious need of being maybe torn down and rebuilt.